Hey everybody, Evan here. See, we have a couple people here. I'll give folks a few minutes to trickle in. It's not yet 1 o'clock anyway. But if you want to jump into the chat, jump into the chat, confirm you can hear me. Feel free to let me know where you're joining from, whether or not you're one of my coworkers, and definitely what you're here for, what you're interested in seeing or learning about or talking about. In the meantime, as we wait for people to shuffle in, you're probably just going to see me paint a little bit. Once we hit 1 o'clock, I'll go ahead and introduce myself a little more formally, as well as the context for what to expect for this video, why this video is a thing, why I'm doing this. And I would love to get any input or feedback as to how you all would like to see this go. I want to deliberately leave this open to the community guidance. I definitely have more than enough to talk about. I could talk until my hair turns gray about this stuff, but I do want to be sensitive to why everybody's here and what you're looking to get out of it. Michael Gaines, I see that you dropped a question in the chat a while ago. I will absolutely address that, but I'll wait until things get started and I can give it its proper due. For anybody else, if you have questions, comments, ideas, feel free to drop them in. If there's anything in particular you'd like to see or see me work on, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I'll do my best to guide the chat. Clifford, though, I can't leave that question be. I have to just jump right in on that one. So your question was, what words or advice or perspective might you offer people who think they are not creative? And the first thing I would say is that's not true. That is not true. Everyone has the capacity for creativity. So I think what it's more about is tapping into that which inspires you and helps bring that out in you. The problem that I find most adults who feel that they're not creative or feel they have a hard time being creative, what they end up facing is they don't have the tools, or they've lost the tools to be creative confidently. And as adults, we're often by necessity perfectionists in terms of everything that we do. This goes for adults, this goes for plenty of the students I've had to deal with in the past, where we sit down with a desire to be creative and we expect to just pump out a masterpiece, or at the very least a pretty picture in the event that we're talking about drawing, painting, that kind of visual creativity. We expect to leave a creative session with something we can share and show other people and say, see, I am creative, I did this thing. And that's not a bad thing. It's not bad to want to produce something you can be proud of, but it comes back to that very tired, but very true saying that perfection is the enemy of good. Is that how it goes? I don't remember how it goes. Maybe it's not that tired. Perfection is the enemy of good. Let's say it goes like that. The point essentially being that to sit down and expect perfection every time you try to be creative, every time you try to paint something, draw something, it creates a very paralyzing effect. You end up getting overly critical of yourself when you don't meet those particular standards. You end up beating yourself up in a very unconstructive way. And the expectation that you're just going to sit down and bang out a really good painting or anything like that, it's not conducive to practicing and learning and putting in the time and mileage that it might take to get to a point where you could and would be proud of what you're creating. For a lot of people, that comes down to discovering a process, a reliable process that works for them. Like for you, Clifford, why don't you share some things that do inspire you or make you feel creative or make you wish that you were creative? Because if I read your question correctly, it sounds like you want to be creative, but you feel like you're not there. So what exactly makes you feel that way? Do you respond that way to television shows, to certain books, to certain products, to inspiring talks? Anything and everything out there can inspire us and make us wish we were creative or more creative than we are. Without additional context, I mean, one of the first things that I would say to someone who says or thinks that they're not creative is, again, you are, but also be open to being bad at what you want to do or the way in which you want to be creative. Discovering a reliable process helps a lot because, art, music, anything else, it's not sitting down and just drawing blind and hoping for a happy accident. No disrespect to Bob Ross. Happy accidents are great, but they're not reliable. And so, especially for people who are trying to do art professionally, it's like, so Clifford, you do UI visualization, so do I. I'll introduce myself formally in just a minute, but I do a lot of UI. And it's like sitting down to build and design an application at the same time. Normally design, it's its own process. It's its own part of the process. And when you combine them together, you could get lucky and lean heavily on something like Material UI and come up with an app that looks nice, works nice, does what you need it to do. But it's probably not going to wow anybody. It's probably not going to be spectacular or unique. But more often than not, it's not going to do any of those things because design is an important part of the process. So sitting down and expecting to just subvert that process entirely or skip it entirely is, a pretty unrealistic expectation in most cases. And that's because design is part of a very reliable process for UI visualization. The design teams or the design input has a lot of impact on how full application is going to behave, how it's going to look, how it's going to be designed. That's part of that process. For something like art or any kind of creativity, the principle is the same. You need a process. You need goals for what you want to achieve. You need to be able to determine whether or not those goals are realistic and actionable, and if they're not, to adjust them, or to be especially open to not meeting them. It's okay to be ambitious, but you can't be ambitious and be disappointed to the point of discouragement if you don't meet those ambitions right out the gate. So yeah, for art, for music, for anything creative, that process is setting your goals, having reasonable expectations, and trying to identify how to meet them. So in the case of something creative, it often involves a lot of practice and a lot of mileage to master a craft or get used to working in a craft if it's something, a brand new field for you. And learning how to learn from your mistakes. We often don't know the right questions to ask going into a new field, especially a new creative one. It's especially hard for younger learners to know the right questions to ask, especially with the huge amounts of information, much of it deliberately misleading on the internet when it comes to something like art. But we don't know the right questions to ask. We don't quite know how to work smart as opposed to working hard. And we need to know how to autopsy our failures when we do fail, when we produce a piece that we don't like, when we try something new and experiment and it doesn't go the way that we'd hoped or wished. We have to be able to learn how to look at that critically, break it down, and determine why we failed or how. And that's going to give us what we need to improve, where we need to focus, how we take that next step forward. I don't know if that really answers your question, Clifford, about, what would I say to somebody who thinks that they're not creative, other than, again, you are. Everyone has that capacity, but determining how to build a reliable process for being creative in the way that you'd like is the battle that any creative individual goes through. We don't just get struck by inspiration. Some people probably do, but then they produce considerably less verbosely than the people who have put together a process that they can live with and live by. Alex, hey, thanks for joining. I hope I can offer some insight that's helpful. I did mention, this is a session that is really geared towards my technical peers. And the reason for that, I'll just go ahead and dig into sort of the intro and opening context for this. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Winston. I'm a senior front-end developer with LinkedIn. I work on the productivity engineering team. But in a past life, I made my living as what's called a visual development artist, an illustrator, animator, that whole world. And over the course of my career, I've done quite a few different things. I've done product design. I have done web development, obviously. I've done art, illustration, animation. I've worked in entertainment art. I've been a teacher in various capacities, both of art and of coding. And so while I really miss the kind of live interaction dynamic of a live classroom setting or of face-to-face interaction, I've long struggled with the desire to put stuff out there again, stuff that might be of useful insight for other people, whether that is art or coding. These days, I get a lot of my coding fix from work. So the art is really something that I'm focusing on as far as formats like this, because that's an itch that doesn't really get scratched by the day job currently. And one of the things that I am responding to with this video, or this attempt, is I've come to observe a lot of disconnect these days, especially on the platform of LinkedIn, frankly. Not that that's a negative, but this is an observation I've had, which is a vast disconnect between the popular understanding of what it is to be a professional creative, or how creativity works professionally, and the reality of it. The popular expectation and the reality of what it is to be something like a professional artist. And by the same token, a lot of my old professional network, those who are still earning their living as professional artists or entertainment artists, production artists, they don't necessarily find themselves in the same position as me, which is to say, working in a large tech company with a lot of very driven, intelligent technical peers who are potentially more open to that dialogue simply by virtue of the proximity. So I'm hoping that, this is one step, probably among many, in bridging that communication gap or that expectation gap. Not to say that I expect my peers at LinkedIn are going to be hiring artists here and there. It's not really that pointed of an intention. It's really more of a sharing the mental models behind what this is all about, and hopefully establishing a healthier way for technical people and potentially artistic people to communicate to each other. Maybe giving a point of reference to my technical peers for those who want to be more creative, as this is Creativity In Day at LinkedIn. That's the idea here. And just to introduce what I mean by Creativity In Day for anyone who is not part of LinkedIn. Every month, LinkedIn as a company holds an In Day, one day a month, one Friday a month. And these In Days are usually themed in some way, Family In Day, Dream Big In Day, what have you. This month's is creativity, and every In Day has come and gone, and I've said to myself, I'm going to do something one of these days. I'm going to host a lecture. I'm going to showcase something, something that I don't typically get to through the course of my daily job, and that is, for me, the art, and finding a way to relate that to my peers. Every In Day passes, and I say, I'm going to do something. And so this month, given that the theme is creativity, it felt particularly, it felt like a particular opportunity to do so. Because creativity is something that I feel I am capable of speaking to. Creativity in a visual art sense is something I can certainly confidently demonstrate, at least to a degree. And so that's what brings us here. As for the things that I'm prepared to discuss, I can talk about art until the cows come home, until my hair turns gray, as I mentioned, and I'm happy to do so. What I am prepared to field are questions about what it means to be a professional artist, what that career path might look like, why I feel that, hey, Shubham, thanks, man, I appreciate that. What that career path might look like, maybe questions about how or why I made the transition out of art making as a profession, questions about what one who not necessarily wants to transition into that career, but either grow into that skill set or explore that skill set, maybe someone with children who are interested in that particular skill set or career path, questions about what that might look like from a practical, pragmatic perspective. This is all, again, coming from the same place of experiencing a lot of diaspora between what the realities of being in this field are versus what people actually expect it to be. And what I mean by that is there's a big expectation of professional artists either being alone in a, like a Greenwich loft, making large wall-sized canvases, just spewing paint at them in a form of raw abstract expression and selling them for $25,000 a piece. And, you sell 4 paintings a year and you're good. That is definitely, I'm not going to say that's nobody's experience, but it is definitely not the average artist experience. And I think one of the important distinctions to establish early on is the difference between that studio gallery artist, somebody who produces commissions for a private studio, versus a production artist. So let me go ahead and open up a little whiteboard. Okay, I introduced myself. I gave a very broad overview of In Day at LinkedIn. I started getting into the difference between, say, a studio artist versus a production artist. My experience is as a production artist, not as a studio artist. Not a value judgment, merely this is the perspective I can speak to or speak from. And within production art, first of all, artists are not generally compensated what they should be. So that's one major distinction between a production artist and a studio artist who relies on private studio commissions. Obviously, there are exceptions. There are really great companies that do a lot to support their artists. There are a lot of productions that really go above and beyond to ensure they bring in the right talent and establish the right pipeline. So that is not a given, but it's generally understood that artists don't make a huge amount of money. However, they do make or can make a good living. And the way in which they do so is often in roles that people don't typically think of. So these can be roles like, for instance, if we're talking about an animated feature, there are hundreds of artists who work on an animated feature film that we don't typically think of. There are story artists or storyboard artists, as they're often called. They can be one and the same. They can be different. There are visual development artists. That would be what I did. There are, if this is a 2D feature, there's everything from in-betweeners and cleanup artists. There are technical artists, lighting artists, artists who specialize in creating color keys. Within VizDev alone, there's a huge gamut of potential domains of expertise that a lot of people don't think of or take for granted. And I'd say the big reason for that is that's the point. You don't want to go into an animated film and see the fingerprints of the production necessarily. I mean, to a degree that can be true. We love seeing a claymation film where you can really see and feel and appreciate the craft, and sometimes you can literally see fingerprints on the maquettes. But in general, you don't want to get every single piece of the puzzle in that way. You don't want to see how the sausage is being made while you're eating it. So the point is, quality art pipelines, design pipelines, they're meant to fade away into the background. So it's understandable that a lot of people don't think about the average role for an artist, but they do exist. They do require professional skill sets that we don't often associate with artists. They do require professional mental models we don't often associate with artists. And that's kind of the tone of the things that I'd like to get into a bit. Alex question: how did you leverage your creative background to identify the career path into your current role? That's a good question. So I was, as I said, an illustrator, animator, specifically a VizDev artist, visual development. And that's something that happens in the pre-visualization stage of most productions. So what that means is the look development, which is also another potential role depending on the studio. Look development of a given thing. How is the world going to look? How are the characters going to look? How is it all going to fit together, feel cohesive? Everything from, okay, we've designed out this character, now let's design their room. Let's make sure that, you can tell exactly whose couch this is just by looking at it. And everything from prop and texture exploration of the character's backpack or the character's hat or whatever the case may be. There's a whole world of things that happen before any 3D modeling or 3D pipelines get involved. So I was doing this, and I was doing, the illustration that you might expect, things like book covers, children's books, that kind of thing. And I was doing design as well, so marketing collateral. I did storyboarding for commercials. I still have a whole lot of storyboards for, those commercials where you see like cleaning solution going through fabric and it just, the green germ-like dirt on the shirt just explodes. That's the kind of thing I storyboarded for a while. It was, I don't miss those particular days, but I was doing a lot of this, and my now wife and I moved to the Bay Area, the SF Bay Area, and it was a lot harder to get this kind of work. I was previously getting a lot of work out of Burbank, down in SoCal. It's much harder to find that up here. It's pretty much Electronic Arts or Telltale while they were still up in San Rafael. Yeah, San Rafael. Or Bust. I mean, there's a lot more now, but it's still often outsourced, or it comes out of Burbank. And in any case, I started learning more technical skills like coding and web dev as a way to better support my existing clients and field new clients in a new market. And that was a good choice. It was a very successful move. But eventually I reached the point where, I would have a client who was scoping out work for art, and then they'd be like, "Oh, you do web dev, or you do coding?" And then they'd say like, "All right, well, instead of art, why don't you work on this e-commerce plugin for us, rather than this other project that we initially approached you for?" And that was because you can find an artist for cheaper than me. Always. Doesn't matter what I charge. There's always going to be someone out there willing to make art for cheaper. So my skill set actually kind of imbalanced my book of business to the point where it was just, I had to read the writing on the wall. And not that I don't like what I do, don't get me wrong. It was the right choice for my family. It was the right choice for the lifestyle I want to be able to afford them. It was the right choice for a lot of reasons. And so that's really the broad strokes of how I went from one to the other, or why I went from one to the other. Let's see, what am I missing here? Yeah, so I mean, eventually that path led me into product design at Airbnb, and from there to LinkedIn a few months before my daughter was born. So the rest is history. As far as art, so I mentioned visual development, look development, character development. All of these things fall under that umbrella of visual development. So what I'm working on here actually is a series of 3 characters. And these are meant to be characters for a tabletop RPG piece of content. Tabletop RPGs, if anyone is not familiar with them, are things like Dungeons and Dragons. This has been a very robust market since COVID. I think when everyone was stuck at home, D&D experienced a bit of a renaissance. Not that D&D is the only tabletop RPG out there. But these are, in fact, character designs in the works for a new setting book. And what that essentially means is there's a book that has new content that players and GMs can use to run campaigns of their own and tell their own stories and explore their own worlds. And these books have things like unique species, unique spells, unique creatures. In this case, one of those species are the gnomes. And these are the 3 varieties of gnome in this particular world. We have the arcane meddler on the left, standing on her staff. The tinker in the middle, working on a small spider machine. And the spelunker on the right, wearing a bunch of candles on his head for cave diving. And the way the character design process works, this is illustration, very much in the realm of illustration, and not something like animation production, which can look very different. But there will always be a creative brief, which in this case is the write-up for the gnomes in this world and the 3 varying subspecies. And those creative briefs will ideally contain all of the useful information. It's like a business requirements doc for a technical project. And from that, I will ideate, and we ideate on body types, we ideate on silhouettes, we ideate on what is most important to read from a given design. And we proceed iteratively. So, for instance, a lot of character design will actually start with something like pure body silhouettes. I don't know what I'm looking for. Here we go. So, if you were designing a brand new look for a dwarf species, for instance, you might have just a whole bunch of body silhouettes to iterate on and explore and present to a non-artistic stakeholder and say, what feels like the direction you're trying to take these guys, what feels closest to your vision, and you go from there, you refine from there step by step. If it's something more like creatures, you can get a bit more creative and fun with silhouette. Silhouette is a really important aspect of something like character and creature design. Think back to, if anyone here was a kid in the 80s or 90s, the whole name that Pokemon thing from middle school, where they'd give you a silhouette of a Pokemon, and then you come back from commercial break, and then they'd reveal which one it is. Those silhouettes of the Pokemon are actually meticulously designed. And silhouette is a big thing for character design. To demonstrate how that can impact the read of a character, the easiest example, or one of the most classic examples, is always going to be Batman. Batman has an extremely clear, extremely purposeful silhouette. And silhouette is something that's easily overlooked by a lot of younger artists. It's something that's easily overlooked as part of a design and how it contributes to a design. But it is extremely important. And in something like animation, where the frames move by very quickly, and the classic is 24 frames per second. The point is that the images on screen are passing by in a flash, and you're often dealing with younger audiences in some cases, not always, but the point is that the imagery that you put on screen needs to be instantly readable. The intention of a given design needs to be instantly readable. And so something like Batman, his silhouette is extremely readable, and it evokes exactly what Batman is about, which is to drive fear into the hearts of Gotham's criminal underworld. His purpose is to be a symbol of fear, even though, he is a superhero or he is a good guy. His power is his ability to drive fear. And I think that is made crystal clear by his silhouette. His silhouette is... This is really a silhouette pulled from like the animated series or the Frank Miller graphic novels or things like that. But it's very long. It has lots of points. It is very, very dark and indiscernible. It's hard to tell what's there. It accomplishes a very, very particular and deliberate purpose. And the same goes for really any silhouette of a well-designed character. Clifford, looking back, how has your approach to art changed after having worked in software engineering for a few years? That's a great question. How has my approach to art changed after working in software engineering for a few years? Well, I suppose it's given me a different relationship with the process. It's given me a different relationship with the documentation behind the process. It's given me a different appreciation for the stakeholder input in the process. Coming at it from a more technical standpoint. Whereas before, it's easy to be an artist and just kind of dismiss stakeholder input as they don't see what I'm getting at, or they're not quite getting what I'm telling them, or any kind of excuse that you can make as a creative, you will probably make as a creative, and it's a bad habit. It's a habit to break. And it's on you too. If you're not visually communicating what you need to non-artistic stakeholders, that is your whole job. That is your responsibility. You cannot expect your viewers, your clients, your the end users of whatever product you're designing for, to be artistic stakeholders, or to have your vision in their heads. It needs to communicate clearly and crystal clearly, without the need for extra contextualization or explanation. And so, it's not to say that I ever disregarded that part of the process, but having to actually inhabit a more technical role like this has definitely given me a more tactile understanding of that aspect of the process. I mean, by now it's years later, so I would have a very, very different approach to that whole conversation than I did in the old days. Or even if I didn't, I'd leave with a very different impression and a very different strategy for it. All of these feel like fundamentals. They feel like a given, but that's why they're easy to take for granted. There's zero reason why I should have that impression, or should have had that impression as an illustrator. At the same time, I'm sure that there are dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands, of up-and-coming artists out there who find it very, very easy to take the stakeholder lens for granted. And I'd say that working in tech that's the one biggest thing that it has definitely helped evolve in me personally. This is also an example of visual development work. This would be and it's an environment piece, obviously, so it's not character focused. A lot of things that happen behind the scenes here, a lot of iteration on shape language, on composition, on determining the color palette for a given piece, the lighting design for a given piece. And a lot of it is happening in real time, not in real time, this is a recording, a time lapse, but in real time during the painting, only as a matter of process, because I've been doing this for as long as I've been doing. And so that's kind of reflective of another very, very easily misconstrued aspect of art making, especially for younger artists. We go online and there are time lapses of these gorgeous paintings or gorgeous character designs or whatever it may be. And, in anywhere from 30 seconds to 10 minutes, we see this painting, this piece come to life, and it's gorgeous, and it makes us feel terrible about our art or our capacity to be creative. But it's not an accurate reflection of the deliberation, the thought, and the design thinking that went into it. If anything, the years of experience, the mileage, it masks that. It doesn't take it away. It just means that you are using your own personal shorthand that you personally have top of mind, even if it's not showing in your process. So that's something I have seen often with students, especially in art. It's extremely easy to get discouraged when it feels like your art heroes are just zipping through a piece, bypassing all of the stages of that reliable process that you feel like you need in order to come up with something even remotely presentable. But they're not bypassing it. They just have done it over and over and over and over, that they can now do that math in their head. They're not doing the math. They're just doing it in their head now. And that's an important distinction. It's probably something also that feels elemental or fundamental, but it's easy to overlook. It's easy to forget. It's easy to put yourself down because you're not there yet. And that's not fair. It's not fair to yourself. It's not fair to your creativity. And on the subject of creativity, creativity isn't just for people who want to make art or people who want to be a professional artist. It's useful for everybody. Creativity it's a delight. Whether you're being creative in a technical capacity, whether you're No, I don't mind the questions from you, Clifford. I'll get to your next one in a moment. And thank you, honestly. Thank you for the participation. I really appreciate it. Again, I'm hoping that the audience will guide this whole thing I want to be sensitive and responsive to what you guys do want to hear and want to see. And if you're not really interested in seeing me talk about art, that's totally fine. Any insight I can offer into this, I will. And in lieu of that, I'm just gonna keep talking. I don't remember what I was saying. So I'm going to answer your question. When do creative insights happen, and what are the conditions that creativity needs to grow? Creative insights happen, in my opinion, when we actively consume. So inspiration, as people tend to think of it, can happen anytime, literally anytime, or it can happen no time at all. It can never happen. And so that's why inspiration is not a reliable go-to or a reliable thing to lean on as an artist, as a creator. But creative insights happen when we learn how to become more active consumers of the things that both inspire us and don't inspire us. And what I mean by that is, as an artist, we get inundated by images of gorgeous art on the internet. We get inspired by the old television shows and books and comics that we read and watched and participated in growing up. But we don't often ask the question of why. Why does this inspire me? Why do I like Batman more than Superman? Why are the X-Men such a powerful read for me? Why is Harry Potter, why does it really strike that particular chord of nostalgia? All of the more recent discussions notwithstanding. Why do I have such fond memories of, coming home after school and turning on Pokemon or watching Power Rangers before school, whatever it is? We don't often ask the question of why. We just take it for granted that, those things were great and they really inspired us. And I think part of the process of becoming a creative is being more active in that internal conversation, understanding why you respond to something. Why one video game, book, TV show, whatever it is, really strikes that chord in you. And it could just be that, it's about this thing that I like. I really like science fiction, and so I think that's why this appealed to me. I mean, that's a pretty shallow interpretation, but it's possible. That could be it. But most likely it's something deeper, because for every science fiction novel that really resonates with you, I bet there are 100 that just don't. So it is never that simple. There's always more to it, and the more that you dig underneath the surface, you find creative insights. You find the atomic building blocks for building those experiences that did resonate with you. You find the ingredients that at least another creator used and composed in such a way and alchemized in such a way to create that experience that resonated with you. And normally, if you're creative, it is your ambition to create similar experiences, whether it doesn't have to be with works of fiction or storytelling per se, or classic storytelling per se. It could be, in terms of building a product, redesigning a social system. There are many different ways to channel that creativity and many different ways to respond to creative insights. But it's a pretty long answer to your question, but that is to me where I think creative insight happens. As soon as we both decide to be more active consumers in that way, more conscious consumers. No, that implies something else. More cognizant, more critical consumers, maybe. And we respond to those impulses and the insights we get by being that. That's where creative insight really comes from. So it's why musicians listen to music. It's why artists look at art. It's why TV showrunners watch TV shows. It's not just like keeping an eye on the competition. It's really to accrue valuable inputs, and not all of those inputs are valuable. But even when they're not, there's something to be learned from it. Why did this put me off so much? Why was this not successful in reaching me? Why did this just completely fall flat for me? Why do I feel like I wasted my time here? If the answer is obvious, great. Jot it down, remember it. It's one more piece of input that you can add to your own creative toolbox. If it is not easy to answer, you have to dig deeper. You have to get as close to those atomic building blocks of the experience as you can. Let's see. Alex, how do you get through writer's block with your creative process? I draw Batman. No, it's kind of a joke. So for me, it would be artist block. It's definitely a thing. It's very, very much a thing. Everybody goes through it. And there was a time when that would have been my answer. I draw Batman. He's super easy to draw, in from a very iconic standpoint. He's fun to draw. He's always fun to draw. You can't be bored drawing Batman. And so it would always just kind of get me going. But what your question really does bring up is a more important point about that reliable process that I was talking about some time ago. Which is to say that if you're doing this professionally, or if you're really, really committed to becoming a craftsperson in your creative field of choice, writing, art, filmmaking, music, product design, UI design, whatever it is, then you can't let that writer's, artist, creative block be a thing. It's always going to exist. It's always going to happen to you, but it's literally your job to be creative. And then, in fact, that's one of the biggest challenges of doing art professionally, is having to show up to work and forcing yourself to be creative when you just, you missed the bus that day and you didn't get to eat breakfast and you just got some bad news from home and this, that, and the other thing. You couldn't sleep last night. It's just, the last thing you feel like doing is being creative and working on an animated production and drawing this character for the 357th time. It's the last thing you want to do, but it's your job. It's what you're paid to do. It's what you've been contracted to do, or it's what you've committed to do as part of growing as a craftsperson. And that's easier said than done, but I think it speaks to another very common misconception about what it is to be a professional artist. It is not easy to force that creativity out of you every day, and that's why it's all the more important to discover a reliable process for yourself for producing creatively sound output. That's not to suggest you need to break the mold and reinvent the wheel every single day, but you should have a process. If I do this thing, and then I do this thing, and then I do this thing, I will have something at the end of the day. Even if it's just, a series of sketches that will maybe spark a better idea the next day. So I hope that kind of answers your question. And then we have Eric, maybe an odd one. Do you do much work for personal use outside of a professional context, like art for your home games of D&D? Interesting you should say that. I have only played D&D once. For all that I produce for it, I have only played it the once, and it was at a company Christmas party. So the answer to that aspect of your question is definitely a resounding no, because I don't have home games of D&D. I would like to. It would definitely be fun. There's just not enough hours in the day, and I have children. Maybe when they're old enough, I can do it with them. That would be great. But do I do personal work? It's a great question, and the answer is definitely yes. I do personal work. For a while, I worked with a number of friends. We started a publishing house that was really just for personal work. We put out art books every year, and other things like coloring books and just little things like that. It's hard to say that it wasn't professional because the goal was to monetize it, but no one was expecting to make an income replacing source of revenue from this. It was really to collaborate, to work together, to put something out there that was ours. So it was a little different. I do a lot of work for people just because I enjoy the work that they're doing. I enjoy their projects, and I want to do it. I'm in a weird position as an artist where I work professionally as a non-artist or not as an artist, which basically means if I were to try to get professional work as an artist these days, I would be relegated to a particular subset of available work that doesn't require full-time, I could not do work on a feature-length animated film these days because I don't have 8 to 12 hours a day to devote to that, aside from the fact that it would be in clear conflict with my current job. It's just not possible. So any work that I could take on has to be extraordinarily flexible, and that normally means passion projects or very small studios or independent creators, that kind of thing. People who certainly don't have the budget to employ artists full-time, or they're not at that stage yet. They probably have a day job of their own. But if I really like their project, if I really like working with them, then, that's the kind of thing that I will absolutely latch onto and often do work for them. Right now, I work on comics. I work on a lot of tabletop properties. I recently did a card game, done some animated music videos, things like that. Hey, Shubham. What's your learning process, and how do you keep updated with what's latest? Any recommendation of books YouTube channel? My learning process for illustration, I assume you mean, or art? Yeah, that's a good question. So if you're desiring to get into art, I definitely have a long list of recommendations I'm happy to get into. As for me personally, I try to stay up to date on what's happening. I try to definitely follow the people that I used to work with, the people whose work I really admire. They're easy to find. They're out there, and actually, the art world is a very small world. So it's really easy to get visibility on what they're up to or get insights from them. If I were to just go through a couple off the top of my head, one of the absolute best that I would recommend to anybody looking to be a visual artist of any kind is a really big pencil. That's better. The Art WOD, which stands for Workout of the Day. And I think that's art-wod.com. There may or may not be a hyphen, but it's run by a guy named Antonio Stapritz, and he's a marvelous artist, but more than that, he's a wonderful producer of educational content. And the way it basically works is every week he puts out a series of workouts, exactly as you might expect, that are focused on different aspects of the craft. So these could be content-based, like, okay, this week we're going to work on, machine shapes, and this might mean drawing a lot of, like, mechs or vehicles or tanks or what have you, props. Other times it's more organic shapes. So, this week's going to be about plant forms and unique creature designs and things like that. And he'll often hone in on specific realms within these different domains. And really I'm writing directly on the white. Yep. And he'll dive right in and force you to flex muscles that, maybe if you are an artist, maybe you don't have to, because the production you're working on doesn't involve a lot of mechs. But it forces you to work muscles that you don't necessarily know you have or don't necessarily maintain. It's a really good one. Other ways to come about to approach this, if you're looking to get into production art, entertainment art, that kind of thing, then one important thing to bear in mind is the digital aspect of the process is really important these days, and I'll talk about that a little bit more because I think it's important. But if you're getting into art or digital art specifically, then Control Paint is a really good one, controlpaint.com, and it's run by a guy named Matt Core. They're the best resources you could find for getting into digital as a medium. They're also good at, improving your ability to make art, but specifically if you feel like, you have the fundamentals and you like drawing, but you can't quite grasp the Photoshop or Procreate or tablet aspect of all of that, Control Paint's definitely the way to go. Tyler Edlin is a very prolific concept artist. Concept art, that's another thing I should talk about. Very prolific concept artist who offers a lot of very, really, really, really useful nuggets of information. He also has a robust program for mentorship and things like that. For things that are a little less personal, there's CGMA, the Computer Graphics Masters Academy, of which there's a 2D and 3D variant. I would personally focus on the 2D because that's me. But they bring in a lot of guest teachers, including guys like Tyler or Matt Core or Antonio, to do, they're typically 8-week long lecture series where each week they're project focused. Each week you produce a project, and in that week there's maybe 3 hours dedicated to live Q&A and demo. There's normally about 6 hours of demo, something like that. You turn in your project at the end of the week, and then the instructor turns around live critique, recorded critique. So you get very, very personalized feedback. You get very personalized direction as to how to improve. It is very industry focused, which is to say, if you're just producing art for you and for fun, that's great. There's no wrong way to do that. Absolutely not. But they are likely to give you feedback as to, like, this is what you should do to get a job at Riot. You know what I mean? So if that's not useful to you, if that's not your goal, just take it with a grain of salt. But it's still a very good resource. There's also things like SVS Learn, Jake Parker, which is a good resource. Schoolism, Bobby Chu, that's a good one. There's basically anything by Tonko Schoolhouse, Dice Tsumi, and Robert Kondo. That's just wonderful. And the up-and-comer, I guess, would be Domestika, which has a lot of really, really great content. It's a relatively new platform, at least as far as I'm aware. Really great content. It's a little bit more bite-sized than some of what you'd find on CGMA, but it's a good one. And for more traditional art, if you're not really into the digital aspect, or you just want to, focus on painting and that kind of thing, there's things like the Watts Atelier. There's things like anything by James Gurney, books, videos, lessons. James Gurney is the author and creator and illustrator of Dinotopia, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a wonderful, wonderful property. Aaron Blaze actually has some really great resources for 2D animation, like traditional style hand-drawn animation, on pegboards and things like that. So that's a great resource. I don't know. I could go on and on. I'm not gonna go on and on. But by all means, if you have anything specific that you want more context on, I'd be happy to give it. Of the things that I said I should talk about, digital art and concept art, most of you have probably heard, assuming we're not talking to an artistic audience. That sounds wrong. Assuming I'm not talking to an audience of artists, concept art is probably something that you've heard of, and it is a term that Dinotopia is great. It is a term that is very, 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 very often misunderstood. When you hear concept art, you often think of the really beautiful, finely rendered art from Assassin's Creed or what have you. And most of that art is actually not concept art. It is promo art or marketing art. It is art that has deliberately been refined and rendered and brought to a point of hyper finish for the sake of promotion. Cliff, what is your favorite book on creative/craftsmanship process? That's a good question. So there's probably a couple. There's The Art Spirit by Henri, which is a good one. There was The Talent Code, which was fun. I'm not sure it would be... Oh, no, I know what my favorite is. I just can't remember the name of it. You know what? I will put the it's got Campfire in the name of it. But it is by Jason Brubaker. Remember that. I will put the link to it in the comments for sure. Campfire something. Wildcard. I cannot remember the name. I will put the link to it. As for anything, as we get into more specifics, actually James Gurney also did some of my favorite books on painting. One of them is Imaginative Realism. That's probably a good go-to for especially my particular brand of what I do. Imaginative Realism is a whole field of painting. And I think that's probably a good list for the time being. Concept art is, so as I was saying, most of those images are promo art. Concept art is typically a lot more boring. Concept art is working on developing things like what does this pipe look like in 3D? What does this pipe look like from all angles? Does it have a little inscription on the side? If so, what does that inscription look like? How deep is it? What is the material of the pipe? What does it look like from down below? What does the bottom of the pipe look like? Concept art is a lot of iterations as well as explorations of things like texture, all of the details, the geometry that a 3D modeler, in most cases, would need to go in and create this in 3D. You can't just draw a picture of a pipe. Well, maybe of a pipe. It's a pretty simple shape. But you know what? You can't just draw a picture of a pipe and expect a professional modeler on a professional production to then run with it. You need to give them all of the information that they're going to need in three-dimensional space. So especially for characters, you can't just draw a character and say, there you go. You have to then draw the character from the side. You have to draw the character from the back. You have to draw the character from the other side if they're not symmetrical. Maybe the character only has one arm, or the character has a lopsided hat. The character wears a satchel on one side. You have to draw that character from every angle. And of course the in-between angles, the three-quarter angles, in order to give a modeler all the reference that they might need. It's a really bad character. All the reference that they might need in order to effectively create that character in 3 dimensions. And the same, of course, goes for any relevant props, any relevant environments. If it's something like a character's room, Elsa's room from Frozen. I have a toddler, so Frozen is a big part of my life right now, but Elsa's room from Frozen would had to have been drawn from a lot of different angles after it was finally determined that the final design is what they were going to go with, in order to allow modelers to be able to create it in 3D. All this is to say that, the 3D modeling behind a production like Frozen is huge, and it is extremely talented, and it is full of a lot of hard work. But I find a lot of people, like my dad, frequently lose sight of the design work that is behind it. Which is to say, a 2D artist, a visual development artist, came in and had to make a lot of choices there and make a lot of explorations in order to spell out every bit of technical spec and information that would be needed downstream in the pipeline. That's not to say they deserve more credit at all. It's more about, it more harkens back to not seeing the fingerprints in a well curated and produced production. And sometimes you get little peaks of that. For instance, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Moana, but the character of Maui, I feel like he is a really great 2D design that did not communicate too well to 3D design. That can happen. Often the reason why that happens is the 2D designer maybe didn't, and I'm not going to go down that role. I don't think that was the case with of Maui, but what I'm getting at is a 2D designer needs to design for the pipeline of the production, which is to say, if I were designing this arcane meddler gnome for animation, she would not look like this at all. Not only would she probably not be illustrated and painted out in this way, unless it was for a cover image or something like that, she would be extraordinarily simplified in a lot of ways, because the more complex the character is, the more complex the shapes get, the more you're dealing with arbitrary folds in their clothing, or things like earrings and things that break their silhouette, the much more difficult it is to animate them. So in 3D, you get a skilled enough modeler, a team of modelers, you can build her in 3D, and then it's a matter of rigging and 3D animation and all sorts of other things. But if you were animating her in 2D, it's a whole other ballgame. There's just a lot of considerations to bear in mind based on the nature of the production and the pipeline that you're designing for. This character has the advantage of being for, again, tabletop RPGs, which means she's just an illustration. She's not going to move. She's not going to have to turn. Maybe she'll be featured in another illustration at some point. So then it will be on me to recreate her on model, which is to say, I need to be able to redraw her and paint her and make her look like the same person in a different angle and with a different expression and a different... in a different context, maybe different clothes, maybe her hair is out, I don't know. And keeping characters on model is definitely a real task. Digital art. Why I want to talk about digital art is because there's a lot of assumptions about digital art. There's a lot of assumptions that the digital aspect means it's easier, or does the work for you, or is a form of cheating, or isn't real art. And there's definitely a conversation to be had there, but digital art, it's really just another medium. It can be abused, it can be taken advantage of, it can produce work that doesn't feel particularly artful, just like anything else. But the digital aspect doesn't, in my opinion, make it less of an art. I'm pushing digital pixels with this paint here. That doesn't mean I am making any fewer of the decisions, the artistic decisions that go into it, whether it's about color temperature and color vibration and the light design of a composition, whatever it is. There's nothing that the digital aspect of the medium really takes away from me except the need to mix paint and clean up and occupy a corner of my small apartment with an easel and a lot of expensive paint tubes. Again, not a value judgment on traditional medium. I love painting traditionally, so it's not something I would advise anybody to not do. And if anything, painting traditionally gets you, will make you a better digital artist, because you will not, you will develop the instincts and mental models that don't force you to be reliant on the tools that can help out. I said that I was going to demo, and so one of the things that I'll do is I'm just going to keep painting while I talk from here. Hope nobody minds. I'm going to move on from the Arcane Meddler because, there will be some finishing work on her, but for the most part, all that's left is her staff and the smoke from her pipe. So I think she's at a point of enough interest where I can move on. So let me just do this, and I will move on to one of the other gnomes and just paint while we keep talking. And in the meantime, don't hesitate to ask any other questions if you have them. Okay. And next, I will work on Tinker. The Tinker's a fun one for me because one of the things that I've really enjoyed about, getting into the tabletop RPG space is the tropes and the space occupied socially by tabletop RPG content has traditionally been very monochromatic. That's a very nice way to put it. What I mean is fantasy and science fiction in many cases as a genre is really white. Really, really white. All the characters are white, all the heroes are white, all the men are young and muscly, all the women are very, very arbitrarily sexualized. There's a lot of problems with the tropes of something like fantasy, and I really like not doing that. I really like pushing against those tropes where I can, while at the same time achieving appealing designs. A lot of people, especially non-artistic stakeholders, will say, okay, this is a female in a fantasy game. Why is she wearing armor that might actually work? Why is she not in a bikini? And it's like, at that point I would walk away, honestly, but that is an attitude that does prevail amongst a lot of people, a lot of clients, a lot of studios even. Fortunately, it is changing. D&D has actually, Wizards of the Coast, the company that owns D&D, and Hasbro, which owns Wizards, has actually put made a lot of efforts and strides in that direction, and that's great. And it is also happening elsewhere, but it still exists, especially among smaller clients. And so I really like finding opportunities to diversify characters, whether that's racially. In this case, I was definitely designing this individual as a person of color, whether that's in terms of age, definitely an arcane meddler gnome in any other property I've ever worked on or had to work on would have, an artist would have defaulted to like a 20-something male gnome casting a giant fireball. And I get it. There's an excitement factor there. The gnome would also be white and probably russet-haired. Anyway, point being, I get why that happens. At least the fireball component of it. But I like finding different ways, exploring lower key ways to give these characters character and make you invested in them and want to play as them. If you're a player, rather than, oh, that's cool, or, that kind of thing. I like taking it further. And so it's nice to be able to introduce a lot more diversity in terms of age, in terms of ethnicity or skin color, in terms of ableism. There's room for characters with missing limbs, in a wheelchair, characters that are, very clearly differently abled in this realm of products now, and that's really exciting for me. And fortunately, there's also a similar pushback against arbitrary sexualization of characters. On that particular point, sexualization of characters, it can have narrative purpose, for sure. It can be a part of a narrative. Jessica Rabbit is more than just her hourglass figure. There is a reason for that. Maybe it's not the best example, but, there's a narrative reason for it. And it leans into its own exaggeration on purpose. But too often in fantasy in particular, it's just like sexualization for the sake of it, and because everyone loves Frank Frazetta. So I can't stand it. I really can't stand it. It bothers me a lot, and so any opportunity to push back against it is a win for me. What is the most damaging myth about creativity, in your opinion? The inspiration myth. The idea that creatives are just waiting around for a muse to strike, and in between all they do is, they drink themselves to an early grave, or, go to boho clubs, and I don't know. I'm talking like I know what the zeitgeist experience for like a New York studio artist is. I don't, but the idea that artists are not building a skill set, a technical skill set that they can rely on to produce a reliable body of work that is designed and executed to technical spec, according to stakeholder expectations and needs, and with the go-to-market needs of a product in mind, is really damaging. One, because it allows clients and companies to underpay artists because they treat them as non-experts. They're not often seen as people who are as collaborators so much as art monkeys, for lack of a better way to put it. And I'm sure this happens to designers as well. It's happened to me in a design capacity enough, sure. But with artists, it's almost a given. It's just like, do this thing for us and go away. And here we will underpay you. And if you don't like this arrangement, then there's 50 other people waiting to take the job for less money. And that's true because a lot of people, a lot of very passionate people who are very inspired now as adults, or who were inspired as kids, whatever it may be, they want to be artists. They want to be a part of that creative process. They want to build worlds and give other people the experiences that resonated with them. They want to create those experiences. And they don't know how else to do it except what they think is the hustle. Take work where you can get it, get exposure. Take work for free if you can't get it, and get exposure, and just build up that network little by little. That's not the way. There is a very, very actionable skill set that artists need to learn and work on and perfect in order to be good at their craft. And in the same way that a software developer needs to learn in order to be good at their craft. Obviously, there are differences in the nature of the craft, but there is a very Sorry, I'm having trouble painting and talking at the same time, which is great for someone hosting an art live stream. There are very real-world paths to follow. There are roadmaps that you can follow that will, if not take you all the way to where you want to be as an artist, they will get you most of the way there. They will take you there. They can develop the skills that you need developed in order to get where you want to be quicker. But a lot of people think that it just comes down to inspiration, that, go out every day and just draw stuff. Going out every day and drawing stuff is great and is definitely part of the process, but that is working hard without working smart. There are a lot of better ways to go about it. There are a lot of better attitudes with which to approach it, and if you just lie around waiting for inspiration to strike, you're not going to produce much in your life. Inspiration is wonderful when it happens, but it doesn't necessarily teach you anything. It doesn't necessarily give you a path to follow for next time, and it certainly doesn't pay the bills. Are platforms like Fiverr a good thing for the artist community? No. This is just my opinion. Certainly not anybody else's. But no. The idea of Fiverr giving artists a place to advertise their services and clients a place to easily hire artists and accrue those services and pay them is a sound idea, but it takes more than a platform to make that a safe space for artists. It also creates a lot of problems where artists are even further undercut. Their fees are even further undercut for both, genuine humanitarian reasons, like there are people in the Philippines or the Ukraine who also want to be artists, and for them, $50 for a commission goes a lot further than for someone living in San Jose. That's valid, and it's hard to argue with that because they should have just as much opportunity to complete that commission as an artist in San Jose. But the artists in San Jose should also be able to expect a living wage based on where they're living. It's one of many problems with something like Fiverr, but even more than that, there are a lot of bottom-of-the-barrel clients and artists on Fiverr. People go to Fiverr with the express expectation of paying as little as possible. And when it comes to art, it's very easy to pay as little as possible. You may not get the best art. You may not get the best collaborative experience working with an artist, but you also don't necessarily know as a client that you'd want that. Most people, as I said, they see artists as art monkeys, get it done and go, as opposed to designers, collaborators, people with a real expertise to offer to a creative project that could potentially shape how that product comes out. I hope that answers your question. They can be good. I'm sure that people have made have made genuine livings off of platforms like Fiverr. I'm sure it has exposed more opportunity for a lot of artists, but it's not without its problems, and I don't know how to deal with those problems. I have ideas that could maybe be part of the conversation, but definitely no solid answers there. I went through, my own Fiverr phase. Everybody did. The same way that everybody goes through an Etsy phase, I think, as an artist, that is. Everybody's had an Etsy at some point in their life. How do you... Clifford, man, how do you feel about Tool's AI art? Good, bad. One potential downside with it, that it might take time to see the effects of inspiration on demand. Yeah, am more than willing to talk about my feelings on AI art. Let me put it this way. AI as the technology itself does not bother me. I mean, it does a bit from a, like, what is the future of human creativity going to look like kind of perspective, that kind of existential terror. It definitely worries me in that regard, but getting a little bit more down to earth with it, it doesn't bother me as a technology. It is easy to see how it will be potentially transformative for a lot of people, how it could change so much about how we work, how we think about work, how we produce as a species, both good and bad. I definitely think it needs a lot of checks and balances that are not in place yet. As far as specifically AI art generation goes, I loathe it with every fiber of my being. And it's easy to dismiss that loathing for a lot of people, including myself, as, oh, I'm an artist and I feel threatened by it. I don't feel threatened by it. That's point one. And I think a lot of artists do, but most probably don't feel threatened by it. I dislike it for a lot of the ethical and legal sidesteps that have been enabled with its arrival on the market. And again, I'm referring specifically to AI art generation, things like DALL-E 2 and even Stable Diffusion, Lensa, Midjourney, these very heavily monetized, and in some cases not monetized, platforms that have been trained on problematic data sets. That really bothers me because a lot of my peers, my art heroes, my mentors and mentees, they have had their entire bodies of work used to train or fine-tune models to just appropriate their style. And again, they're not worried about being replaced. If you're somebody like Greg Rutkowski, you're not going to be replaced. You're never going to be replaced. It doesn't matter how good AI art gets. He's always going to have a market demand for the particular domain of production art that he occupies. It will probably impact the ease with which some younger artists find work, but it also depends on the markets in which they're looking. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, but the ethical issues behind how the models were trained, the problems with memorization and deep diffusion models, the utter lack of consent for the massive amounts of copyrighted imagery that were used, have been used, continue to be used, and enabled, which it is enabled to be used, need a grammar check there, is a problem for me. And so that is why my relationship with AI art generators is a poor one, to say the least. And I have been, I've also experienced quite a bit of aggressive cyberbullying as a result of it, and as a result of my determination to speak out against it. So, my feelings are also complicated by that. I'm going to go ahead and jump on top of the line work now. As far as, divorcing the whole conversation from my feelings about it, I do think it could be really interesting to see how it changes production pipelines, how it enables studios with their own data sets and their own collections of work on which to train to speed up, the background development, matte painting process, or anything like that. I don't want to see anybody who does that professionally displaced, but I can't argue with the fact that as a tool, it's going to be used. Now, I would like to see that the people with the right mental models and instincts and design decision-making capacity involved in the creative process and basically shepherding the output of an AI model. And that may be the case. I don't know what that would look like mechanically, but, I think there's a lot of interesting conversation to be had there. For the individual artist, I worry that, people will rely on it too much. I think younger artists may rely on like Midjourney as an idea generator too much. And already there's a problem among younger artists where they don't spend enough time practicing and flexing their iterative muscles. Something that I like to say a lot is your first idea when starting a new composition, your first idea is never your best, even if it is. The point being that it's really important to go through the process of, thumbnailing a composition 10, 50, 100 times before deciding on what you're going to move forward with. Because even if your first idea does happen to be your best and what you choose to go with, it is important to get all those bad ideas out. It is important to see them. It is important to be able to analyze them and autopsy them and recognize, okay, why doesn't this one work? And that will inform every step of the way forward. So that's one potential downside I see to the ease with which it will probably be to generate ideas with AI art generation. Inspiration on demand, though, is not something I'd thought about. That's interesting. Inspiration on demand, a lot of people will very likely use it as mood board generators, in the same way that people comb through Pinterest and just create boards. Heck, I do that if I'm designing a character and there's, the first thing that I'll do, the first step of any character design process is to gather reference. And sometimes that's just like color reference. Oh, I like the colors here. Sometimes it's, I like the collar on this shirt. I think that would work really well. Things like that. I'm getting too peachy here. So, as an inspiration engine, it's hard to make that argument given that we all kind of do that, and Pinterest is really just 1 degree removed in a lot of ways. I mean, it's not, because the images are not inherently stolen or relying on data laundering and a database of stolen and non-consenting copyright protected imagery. But again, divorcing all of that from the conversation, there's probably an argument to be made there. It's a tough conversation for me to have. It's one that actually wears me out a lot. A lot of that's the cyberbullying and all that, but it's been a tough conversation to have in social spaces lately, especially as part of the company that I work for. So I'm still kind of navigating what that means, what that is. I hope that answers your question. Certainly open to any opposing thoughts if anyone cares to share their own opinions. Okay, so she's coming along. As you can see, I just kind of laid in a very, very generic background color. Like for the Spelunker, it's orange. For her, it's lime green. If I turn off the Arcane Meddler, for her it was purple. And I just kind of use that as how I'm going to key the overall character composition. So again, for the Arcane Meddler, if I turn her back on, she reads as very purple. She's not this royal purple. She doesn't have purple skin, but a lot of her color scheme pulls in that direction or is keyed by that idea. And I just find that as a helpful way to, keep these character concepts unique and distinct from each other, and relying on things like anatomy decisions and how I've chosen to design gnomes in general to be the unifying factors. So some of those in this case would be things like the proportions of heads and hands and feet to their shorter stature. So they're shorter individuals. They have quite large hands. They have larger noses than I would draw on, say, a human. Things like that. Their lower legs are quite short. So it took me a long time to arrive at actually an anatomy for gnomes that I was happy with. One, because gnomes are kind of a dime a dozen as far as concepts go. Lots of people have designed gnomes to death, and I always like to at least try to pursue that new look or that new idea or that new thing that's going to freshen up the concept. And I don't think this is breaking the mold here, but I kept trying to push that, and that certainly contributed to how long it took me to arrive at a kind of schema that I feel happy with for my gnomes, if you will. I'll call them my gnomes. And I really enjoy that part of the process. Further, with characters like gnomes or halflings or the little folk, as they're often called in D&D parlance, it can be really challenging, and it's something I see quite a lot in art in this world. It can be really challenging to make them not read as miniaturized humans, and that can actually be a little unintuitive, because they're humanoid and they have pointed ears and all, but they're humanoid. They're humans basically. They're just little, but it's more than that. If you take a human figure and you literally just shrink them down, they're going to read like a little human. They're going to read like a homunculus. They don't read like another species or another, not to say that you can't be little and not and human. That's obviously not true, but in the context of this kind of fantasy realm, they don't read as their own subset of fully realized and evolved people with their own maybe cultures, their own worlds, their own practices, their own this, that, and the other thing. If you just take a human and squeeze them down, it can actually be surprisingly difficult to find the right proportions of things like head and hands and feet, limb length, torso length, to achieve that look without either feeling hokey or looking like a human with actual gigantism, which is perfectly valid for a character design, but not necessarily for a gnome design. Okay, so we are at about 95 minutes now. I'll keep going for a bit. I'm just going to work on this Tinkerer for a while. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask, or if you don't have questions and you just want to hear a little bit more about one thing or the other, I'm happy to explore some of the process more, some of what the career progression or that whole world looks like from a professional lens. I can dig more into the skill set and some of the decisions that go into putting together a composition, especially under spec. But I do appreciate all of you folks participating the way that you have. Actually, now that I think about it, there's one question I forgot to answer, isn't there? Michael, you asked a question yesterday, but I didn't answer it. So your question is, what is the best source of finding character and story designers that are budget-friendly? As a disabled Vietnam veteran, I've created a number of shows. However, my budget is limited at this time. Fiverr. No, in all seriousness, though, well, I'm going to be honest. I'm not quite sure what uh, being a disabled Vietnam veteran has to do with finding artists and storyboard artists and that kind of thing. I certainly don't think it should be a detractor in any way or a blocker for you. I don't see why. And if for whatever reason you run into artists for whom it is a blocker, then I'd say avoid those artists like the plague, because they sound like terrible people. But aside from that, finding artists that are budget friendly, it shouldn't be hard to find artists that are friendly to your budget. What is probably going to be hard is finding artists who can execute on the vision you want them to within your budget. So that really depends on your expectations. What I'd recommend offhand is definitely platforms like Fiverr, Upwork. It's a possibility. I would never recommend it. I would actually recommend more word of mouth focused sourcing. So even something like logging onto Facebook or Reddit and finding an art group and asking if anybody's interested to help you scope out a potential contract there. Most of the times, artists are more than happy to have a conversation or at least, point you in the right direction. If you're looking for more, what's the word, operationalized processes, you got to go with like illustration agencies, which exist exclusively to find illustrators' work and take a commission of that work. That's definitely an option. You could approach something like the Bright Agency and say, here's my project. Are any of your illustrators available / appropriate? However, that is not going to be a budget-friendly approach. Illustration agencies are really good for illustrators. They're not great for small and independent creators because they do charge at or above market rates, typically. They often specialize in things like editorial or marketing-focused illustration and animation contracts. Again, worth a try, and even if, they just connect you with some of their illustrators, those are conversations you can have that point you more in the right direction. Maybe the illustrators would be willing to, talk you through it or explore it a little bit off book. I don't know. Other than that, reach out to your network, see if anybody has experience in animation and television, and see if they can pass your request on. That's the best I could offer, really. But definitely Facebook, Reddit, Instagram, they're good places to start. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to have a conversation with a group of artists to help you, help guide you in finding the right people for your project. It just might take some time, and you may have to be willing to accept either lower quality or higher budget. Thanks, Alex, for coming by. Okay, well, if nobody else has any questions, then you know what, I'll go ahead and call it there. We're at about an hour and 40 minutes. I want to thank you all for coming by and participating. By all means, if, this video will be up after this, I will upload some links into the description with regards to what we talked about. For those of you who work at LinkedIn, feel free to reach out to me privately if you have any other questions. Anyone else, feel free to leave a comment. Feel free to, question, tips for planning the execution / building user interfaces to solve stakeholder problems. I work on internal tools and infrastructure, have a front-end background, and don't have design resources. Yeah, that's me too. Tips for planning the execution, building of user interfaces to solve stakeholder problems. I mean, there's really two ways to come at that particular issue. There's the design approach, and then there's the technical approach, and both of them are needed. As an engineer, you can probably answer the technical aspect of those questions on your own without design resources. It's a real challenge if you're not confident as a designer as well. My best piece of advice would be to rely on robust libraries. Things like Material UI or even something smaller. If you're building your own components and you hate writing CSS, okay, use Tailwind. Something that would take a lot of that overhead off of your plate. If you use a UI component library, you're not going to have to worry about every step of accessibility, which should be a part of the design process and the architecting process. So that takes actually a big weight off your shoulders. You can pretty much be sure that out of the box, every component is going to be at least a baseline level of accessible. In terms of solving stakeholder needs, that's where things get more complicated. The best thing you could do there is be sure that you understand every aspect of the stakeholder problem and what they need to solve that problem, and try to keep an open mind to distinguish between what they think they need to solve that problem and what they may actually need to solve that problem. Of course, you got to hedge that with what is practically achievable, both in terms of how much time you have to produce that solution and how many people are on your team, or what technology stack you're using. All of those are questions that need to be well thought out. I mean, the best thing I could do is give yourself a checklist of questions to answer, so that even if you find yourself stuck and you don't know what to think about next, you at least have that one next step to do, that reliable process. As a freelancer, that was a real big problem in the early days. In trying to scope out work, it'd be like throwing a dart at a board, and wherever it lands, that's the number you charge. It shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't have been that way. It took a while for me to figure out my process for scoping out work. And the same definitely goes for user interfaces and exploring stakeholder problems. I unfortunately don't have anything more actionable than that. If you want to talk out a specific stakeholder problem or a specific project offline, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to have that conversation. But from the broad strokes perspective, that's probably all I can offer. Also, don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel every time. All right, well, thank you, everybody. Again, don't hesitate to reach out privately, to comment, to feel free to let me know if this isn't what you thought it was going to be and you are disappointed. Any input helps. I would like to offer more, both on the subject of creativity and specifically for people interested in the art side of things. So I'm learning as much as you guys. All right, thanks, everybody.